Thank you, Ingrid. It's a great pleasure to introduce Craig Wilkins as our first speaker in one of the open sessions tonight. Craig is a member of the architectural faculty at the Taubman College, University of Michigan. I know his work because I've encountered it through his academic writing, particularly a very important book, I think, very important for me anyway, a book called The Aesthetics of Equity, Race, Space, Architecture, and Music. Music is maybe going to feature a little bit tonight, I'm just looking at him. Maybe can't read the space. And also a book, a short book that became very influential called Roughneck Constructivists. Craig, but as well as preaching to us academically, Craig also writes journalism and is a regular contributor to many national and international publications, and so has a very broad set of readers and addressees in his work, which I think is incredibly important and one of the most important aspects of it, that it has a broad reach. Craig is going to talk to us tonight from a semi-personal perspective about questions of equity and justice amongst within architecture around the training of black architects in particular, and looking at some of the questions around representation, particularly in the United States in relationship to that. But I think that some of the things that Craig is going to talk about are absolutely transferable. They're certainly transferable to the UK context, and from what I know about the Swedish context, this is also the case. So without more blur from me, I'd like to welcome Craig to the floor. Thank you very much.
Okay, can you hear me back there without this mic on? No? All right. Can you hear me now? Okay. All right. A couple things first. Does this light? It doesn't work. Okay, it may be difficult to see some of the slides. No, but that's okay, I guess. First, I wanted to thank Erling and Henrik and Pamela and Ingrid and Emily and all the folks who were so instrumental in getting me here. I can't thank you enough. It's been a ball so far, and I can't imagine it being any less going forward. So, and I also want to thank all of you for gifting me your time and your presence. I will try not to waste it. And then there's sort of one last thing I wanted to say before we get started is, I think this water's that outside of me feeling a little bit like Janet Jackson with this thing on, nothing's wrong with it. I'm going to have to channel her because I was under the impression that I had an hour to film, and that's not the case. So I'm going to probably speed through some of this much faster than I had planned on doing. So bear with me if I sort of cut some slides off before you've actually had a chance to read all of the material. So it's not because I don't care about you. It's because I do care about you, and I want to get us out of here when we're supposed to. Okay, so having said that, let's begin. So, I'm an architect, and I should say that up front. Not that the designation matters that much to me, though I am proud of the fact, but considering it's a legally protected professional designation conferred by a body of government, I suspect it will matter to some of you in this room. For example, what can a practicing architect tell us about exclusionary structures and tactics? The field is a direct beneficiary of such. Well, to a large degree, this is true. However, the fact that I am an architect is important, critical even, to my being here before you, for two reasons. The first is that architects are generally considered artists. And to a great degree, it's a status well earned. The best of us are indeed aesthetic experts, and it is this expertise that allows us entry into the art world's special conversations, its secret homes and gardens, its exhibits, retrospectives, magazines, lectures, podcasts, and the like. The nod to that design acumen is what provides me with a great deal of legitimacy in the world of aesthetics. The second reason is that I'm a Black architect, and it is this point that makes all the difference. So Kim Dovey once wrote that the will to form is really the will to inform, that the desire to build something is really the desire to say something. Since it's clear that the production of Black aesthetics have been profoundly influential in just about every artistic endeavor imaginable, why is it that there are so few people of color in architecture? What is it about this field, this artistic pursuit, that keeps that voice at bay? And make no mistake about it, at bay it is. African Americans represent 13% of the US population, but only 5% of the students in US schools of architecture are people of color. And just over half of that attend only 6 schools in the United States. And those are the historically Black colleges and universities. And it only gets worse from there. In the academy, African Americans constitute a little more than 3% of the architectural faculty, with the overwhelming majority of that number, again, teaching at those 6 historically Black colleges and universities. And add to the fact that less than 2% of all registered architects in the United States are African American. 2%. A number that has remained relatively flat over the last 30 years, while every other ethnic group has increased. It becomes highly probable that this underrepresentation is less than simply a natural occurrence. So in my book, The Aesthetics of Equity, I begin with the hypothesis that something other than the desire or the ability was responsible for these low numbers. Thus, I set out to examine and analyze the seeming resistance to African American participation in the discipline of architecture. What I found was both a structural and specific resistance that is less than flattering to the academy, profession, and surprisingly, the people of color as well. In different ways, all 3 share responsibility for the current conditions, and thus all 3 are responsible for changing it, if change indeed is the goal. It's an observation that that's not only relevant to my field specifically, but I believe it will resonate strongly with other fields as well. The names only need change to protect the innocent. However, first, the basics. I'm going to proceed here in a manner that I normally don't, I haven't done often, as this is going to be somewhat of a semi-autobiographical talk. So I'm sharing with you, please understand and be kind to my feelings. But I think it's a pretty important way to sort of demonstrate these sort of structural inequities that people come across. So I'd like to tell you a story. This is how I'm going to talk. Then I'm going to offer you some observations that grow from that story. And then finally close with an example or two of how I've actually personally acted to combat them. Now, this story centers on a fictional graduating class of highly selective students in the United States. It would be called Magnet Public High School. I'm not quite sure what the equivalent term would be here. But it requires an entrance exam. It provides a rigorous college prep curriculum. And oh, by the way, it happens to be predominantly African American. Now, do keep in mind that this latter part, because for a variety of reasons, that's not the norm. Okay, so here we go. Typically in high school curriculums, talk of architecture is the privy of the art department. Sometimes a math teacher will invoke some architectural event to illustrate the applicability of a mathematical equation. And if the school has a drafting or technical vocational component of some kind, talk of architecture will be found there as well. But in general, art is where it starts. Now, exact numbers are difficult to obtain, but it's clear for decades, and in earnest since the 70s, art budgets in high schools, this would include art, music, and the like, have suffered a disproportionate amount of cuts in education across America. There's also generally acknowledged that public school programs in large urban areas have carried the brunt of even that budget cutting. So the chance of encountering an architect or architecture in general in high school has diminished over the last 30 years for all students, and has diminished drastically in public schools, especially in urban areas where many underrepresented students are found. So, for example, in Detroit, one of the largest school districts in the country, one that is 82% African American, there is only one high school in the entire city that has a drafting program. And that program just went from 3 instructors and double period classes all day to 1 instructor, single period classes, half day. I'll assume this is the worst case scenario, but it might not be. What we can be sure is this. There is little audio, visual, or textual material, role models, and or illustrations of tangible success of architecture in general accessible to students, but almost none concerning African Americans in particular, made available to inspire or excite students to pursue careers in the design professions, particularly architecture, historically thought to be inaccessible to African American children. Now, this is the norm in the country. It's not an aberration. Christian Grace points out, if you don't see people working in a profession that look like you, you probably don't think of that profession as something you would be successful in. True enough. But for many, if not most underrepresented students, the deliberation never even gets that far. Most simply are unaware of the possibility of the profession at all. But of course, our story centers on one of the better schools, where countless counselors are all knowledgeable and eager to assist their charges in pursuing their dreams. So these students do hear about architecture. A few may have even taken a computer drafting or an art course or both and enjoyed it. Then comes the time to choose a college and the consideration of cost, and they realize, comparatively speaking, architecture ain't cheap. Just a cursory review of professional programs shows that at the time, 5 to 6 years, in addition to ancillary costs of equipment, software, studio material, plus puts the study of architecture in relatively the same league with the study of law or engineering in terms of costs, upfront costs, but not in terms of initial or even future earnings. Thus, one must weigh the benefits of taking relatively the same amount of time and money and investing it in an architectural career, or something with a higher return on investment. For students who are struggling for funds to go to college, which is most students, certainly, the students of color disproportionately show. Even for those who are ensconced in the middle class, or for students who see themselves as less able to depend on financial support from their family initially upon graduation, architecture is a difficult argument to make. Just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Now, of course, money isn't everything. There are a plethora of reasons for choosing a career, like how happy it makes you, what kind of fulfillment you get from it personally, and the like. And in truth, research has shown many students of color enter into the discipline for reasons other than solely financial. The question then becomes, can those other reasons be supported in their architectural matriculation? So, okay, let's say that after much consideration and discussion, a good number of our graduating students decide to give architecture a try. Wildly excited about the possibilities that an architectural career can provide, they are zealously eager to make it happen, like you. So of course, they go to university and head for their first official experience with architecture as an area of study. Like all disciplines, There are courses that initiate, educate, and some might say indoctrinate students. Okay. All right. Sure. Thank you. So like all disciplines, there are courses that initiate, educate, and some might say indoctrinate students to the field. These courses lay out the framework for what the area of study is, what it's not, what it does not, and why it's important. In most architectural curriculums, that first case occurs in the introduction to and survey courses. Such courses present to the new student the story of architecture, who makes it, who purchased it, whose ideas are important, and at the same time communicating by default who doesn't use it, who doesn't purchase it, and who can you ignore. It's a story that is often offered up as both neutral and natural, simply a chronicle of all that's worthy. However, in reality, it is a story of those who tell the story, and that story is neither neutral nor natural. For any field to justify its control over a specific body of knowledge, establishing a notion of history, and a progressive history at that, is imperative. For the public, the belief that what the profession offers is a time-honored, ever-increasing, and of course, essential service is its key to its willingness to allow the monopoly to continue. For the professional, the belief that what they do is not only all of the above, but also both specific and special, is crucial to attracting future students to perpetuate the profession. History becomes both the repository of the past and the promise of the future. History is where the heroes and heroines are acknowledged, emulated, and advanced. Now, architecture is no exception. In fact, it might be more the rule than most. Yet within its historical narrative, it pays little attention to the presence, much less the contribution of African American practitioners. Now, given what history means to sustaining professions and attracting new initiates, the importance of that omission cannot be overstated. Forms of mass dissemination, journals, magazines, newspapers, books, museum exhibits, public lectures, films, and the like that feature the work of African American architects are at best underwhelming. To date, there have been perhaps 25 books of architecture in print documenting the work of African American architects. One African American architectural critic to have written for a major metropolitan newspaper, and 0 editorial positions at major architectural publications. And the work of African American architects in general are few and far between. Simply put, within the annals of architecture, the work of African American architects continues to be, to borrow from James Baldwin, evidence of things not seen. To our students who are now looking at all there is, was, and will be important to the profession of architecture, and saying little if any characters in a narrative that look like them, instead of drawing some strength or at least some confidence from the narrative of their chosen profession, they're left to wonder just where, if anywhere, they might fit into that story. And it's within this budding concern they enter the world of the most influential foundation course they will ever take in their architectural educational career, and that is the design studio. Now, without getting into the cornucopia of studies that look at the pedagogical and ideological formation of the design studio, it's clear that the studio is a unique model of education, especially within the university setting. It provides unprecedented personal interaction between the student and the teacher in the most intimate manner. It is highly subjective by nature, and even more so because there are few checks and balances on that interaction. Thus, there is an inordinate amount of power placed in the hands of the studio instructor to shape and mold the method, manner, purpose of their student charges. Studio faculty produce within a particular aesthetic and cultural framework, institutionalized their cultural and professional legitimacy in the studio. Simply said, the manner in which studio is taught is culturally determined. The projects that get chosen, the aesthetics that get preference, the set of concerns to be addressed, all of that doesn't just happen. Somebody chooses it. Someone makes it happen. Often taken as both natural and neutral, Aronson and Anthony correctly observed that generally white male architects are treated as if their sex and race were utterly irrelevant to their work, which, of course, viewed objectively, is quite the contrary. Architecture is not culturally neutral. From the manner in which it's taught, to the manner in which it's written, to the method by which it's practiced, the notion that such is the case is just a fallacy. Now, back to our students. In and up to their elbows, our wayward students are finding it difficult, a bit more difficult than they expected. But then again, ever hopeful and still full of promise for the profession, they soldier on, believing in time it'll all work out. Besides, classes aren't the only place they can get a feel for the profession. The program has ancillary activities like lecture series, college organizations, and even travel abroad opportunities designed to bring other voices and perspectives to the student body. Perhaps it's here where they might find a linchpin that speaks to, if just a little bit, that speaks to them as students of color and potential architects. Unfortunately, oftentimes, these students searching for a way into a program and profession, the lecture series is yet another place where they will be found wanting. Despite its deployment as a symbol of democratic, equitable, and accessibility, the Academy is not without its blind spots. And lecture series are telling for revealing one of those blind spots. Often, very little research goes into identifying speakers for lecture series. Committee members routinely invite people for whom they are familiar. Keynotes may be exception, thank you very much, but the intermediary series, the ones that get you from keynote to keynote, big name to big name, are often filled by those who are in the loop. Not that those chosen are not worthy of being speakers, but often the series is formed from suggestions from faculty. The very faculty that are as unaware of the growing marginalization of their students of color as they are unaware of practitioners of color. The problem isn't that they are considered and rejected, it's just that they haven't been considered at all. It's both revealing and perpetuating the blind spot. But back to our students. Having perhaps not found that which grounds them in the lecture series, feeling a bit excluded from the curriculum, somewhat detached from the unfamiliar assumptions that serve as the hidden foundations of the discipline, these things continue to grow. Their uneasiness continues to grow. While they can't put a finger on it, it's clear now that something's amiss, something substantive. Ralph Wiley describes it that way. As a matter of trying to speed this up, I'm not going to read it, you can read it. But at this stage, most students cannot articulate this. They simply feel disconnected, isolated, and often unenthused. So where can they go to express this gnawing feeling of maybe having made a mistake? Who can they approach who might understand, have some insight into their concerns, and help them cope? If they're lucky, perhaps there's a faculty member who sympathizes with their concerns. If they're very lucky, they can find a faculty member of color with whom they might speak. But most are not so lucky. The dearth of people of color as professors in this profession is simply shameful. There's no other way to put it. Shameful. As I mentioned, African Americans constitute a little more than 3% of the architectural faculty. Approximately 2% are full-time, 1% part-time. By the same token, they make up 23% of the faculty of all disciplines at American institutions of higher learning. Of the full-time architectural faculty that are tenured, 1.8 are African American. Of total tenure in all departments, it's 4.8. The same conditions exist in the realm of adjunct faculty as well. The area, it's interesting that the area that provides the most flexibility for departments to hire has the lowest percentage of African Americans. Why? Because they are caught in the same loop. you hire who you know. Now, back to our students. Let's say, for the sake of argument, these students are lucky enough to have found a faculty member or two of color. There is no guarantee that this condition will be of any solace. There is a chance that one said faculty member may simply not be sympathetic to their concerns. Every brother ain't a brother. Having gone through probably as challenging, if not worse, academic conditions, there's no guarantee he or she will see anything wrong with the current ones. And two, said faculty may be dealing with their own sense of disconnect and simply unable to help. For example, it's not uncommon for African American educators to have to deal with, in addition to the kinds of concerns endemic to the academic life in general, a level of isolation from colleagues, an assumed representation of their people on all issues, or that inclusion issues or exclusion issues are by their very nature their issues. Exaggerated expectations due to his or her hire being a seminal or pioneering event. What I mean by that is, if they fail, it's a group failure rather than an individual failure. That's a lot of pressure. So, there you have it. At this point in their matriculation, the remaining students realize that this is it. This is all we get. This will be their lot for the next 4 to 6 years. Their search for a more substantive connection will not be provided. It is, if it's to be at all, it will have to be created. And their effort to do so may very well be seen as a hostile act within the department, an unnecessary effort at separation that could bring untold consequences. You're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. Still, the development of such a connection is often an act of survival, an effort to situate themselves within the general architectural narrative. Some majority students simply take that for granted, because everything associated with the profession already supports their story. Yet, despite all the systemic obstacles that they face, in addition to the rigorous efforts generally required of all architectural students, we know these students still triumph. They persist, excel, and reach their goal of achieving an architectural degree. It is at this point that they rightly believe that it's all been worth it, and now, I get to enjoy the fruits of my labor, the benefits of all of that stuff. And so they turn their eyes to the waiting world of practice that once threatened optimism full bloom once again. Particularly because of the type of early education that was received at HBCUs, the Tuskegee model of industrial education. African American architects traditionally are see more opportunity only within certain professional positions, the technical or graphic areas of their implicit, historically black college and university foundations. And this is true even for students who attend majority institutions. They are stereotyped as being good with their hands, not with their head. Employers have little basis for believing they can design as well, if not better, than someone else. Why? Because they too have undergone the same education mentioned before, and they too have rarely discussed a person of color in their history class, in more than a handful of profiles in Architectural Record or Architectural Journal or New York Times, none on film, well, few, on film, few on the radio, or anywhere else for that matter. For them, they're like Bigfoot. Never seen them before. I've heard rumors, but where? They too can find little evidence of black architects ever having designed anything of note, and thus often find it difficult to conceive of a student of color in a position as a designer, which is what all graduates want to be. Because that is the most prominent and powerful position in traditional practice. It is the face of the practice. Judged in this light by educators, employers, clients, and the media, African Americans traditionally have found it difficult to display their versatility within the constraints of a professional office, habitually being placed in the back office, the production areas, where they're good with their hands, as draft persons, technical coordinators, and the like, rather than the high-profile creative positions. And while this perspective is changing, and it is changing, it's not changing fast enough. Now, our newly minted graduates are now finding out that African American architects on a comprehensive scale must daily contend with the reluctance of employers to promote African Americans to positions of representation inside and outside the firm. And little is done to recognize and develop their rich resources that they bring to the table. In fact, it's just the opposite. And it's only a matter of time before they decide that to fully reach their potential, they must have their own practice. Which, of course, does little to change the mind in the public or in the private sector of their ability to do the heavy lifting of design. But it does do wonders for that connection for which they have been searching for so long. They now can practice in a manner they so choose, perhaps even in a manner in which they first became interested in architecture, if they can even remember that. Or, and this happens often, they just quit. They just quit. It's not worth the trouble. And they do something else. So, in the best case scenario, these students go on to have successful, long-running practices, employing a good number of people, and over several decades. Their work has earned some praise and recognition among their peers, and they have not been unknown to the general public as well. Now this, in and of itself, is no easy task, considering that far too few in their own community who have the desire and ability to employ an architect I want to be very clear about this. It is not a requirement that black people hire black architects. I'm not arguing for the balkanization of the profession. That's foolishness. Still, the lack of support from the African American service and consumer communities demonstrates a certain amount of apathy on the part of both the practitioner and a potential client pool that has to be examined. My point is, as both a cultural and professional group, African Americans bear some responsibility for their seemingly invisibility in the field of architecture. And in this current climate, where we have more African American millionaires than ever before, even some billionaires, the client pool is becoming deep enough for practitioners to mine that group of people forever. Still, all in all, both our students have seemingly achieved the kind of professional success they envisioned all those years ago on embarking onto this professional journey. In doing so, they joined a long line of people of color who've been involved in the practice of architecture, although not always at their leisure. I would argue that those who helped build the White House probably didn't want to do it. Since the 1600s. Yet amazingly, despite this long and storied history, and the success of our two architects here, and other firms across the nation, was one to ask most architects, and certainly most non-architects, it appears that people of color have no history in this field, no legacy. They are not part of the lexicon of the professional timeline, and thus not part of the public thought process when it considers questions of architecture. And unfortunately, this is partly, again, a failure on architects of color who have not adequately prepared their firms for life after the principal. In the public realm, African American practitioners lack any long-standing, multi-decade offices. Maybe about 4, maybe. No publicly identifiable, accessible legacy that stretches across a professional timeline. Now, when I speak of this legacy, I'm not talking about a value judgment about whether the work is worthy or not. This is not an aesthetic issue. This is a longevity issue. While a hefty amount of aesthetic expertise is central to a firm's viability, that's not the point. I am simply pointing out that some firms have remained viable long enough to become part of the conversation, the layperson's conversation, It's part of the public lexicon. People remember those names and faces in those fleeting moments when they think about architecture at all. And here's the interesting thing. When they think about it, they become informal historians. They pass along that knowledge to their friends, to their children, to their acquaintances. When the kids play with blocks, they think building. Talk, oh, Frank Lloyd Wright. Their parents think architecture. When the kids ask what that is, they tell them. They tell them what they know. And they tell them where they can go to find out more information. They can go to the bookstore, go to the web, look up Frank. Like he's their buddy. Look up Frank. And what they're likely to know about that firm is just a little bit of history. Thus, they act as conduits of this legacy. They act as late historians, dandelions of architectural discourse. Johnny Appleseed, spreading the information wherever they go, whenever the moment arises. When the public is asked to discuss architecture, they remember those long-standing, high-profile firms. And that's where they start and often end the conversation. Like it or not, practitioners of color have an image problem. And it stems from a deeper issue, and that's one of transition. In short, far too many firms are one generational. Now, of course, this is true throughout the architectural profession, but for firms of color, it is particularly true and troublesome. The problem with a single generation firm are numerous. African American firms overwhelmingly hire students and professionals of color. It's here they learn all aspects of practice. Aesthetics, economics, marketing, you name it. One generational firms do not allow for the institutionalization of knowledge or client basis, thus leading the most firms to have to reinvent the wheel every time the owner dies. Every time. One generational firms leave practitioners of color open to the "we can't find no criticism." Maybe you're working with a practitioner for 50 years, build up a client base. That firm has to go under because the principal did not provide for the transition. The name disappears. Everybody else in that office stays the same. The name disappears. Can't find it. Can't find it. Anyway. At last count, I think 75% of all architectural firms are 5 people or less. They're often just small firms. Now it's hard, if not impossible, to provide a next generation legacy with an office of that size. But still, that leaves 25% of the operating firms with at least the potential to become more than one generational. What percentage of those firms of color, I can't say. However, what I can say is, as near as 10 years ago, 74% of architects of color were in offices that were owned by African Americans. And you do the math. If 3/4 of African American employment is dependent on work in firms of color, and those firms are only one generational, disappearance is inevitable. It's just inevitable. For every generation, the struggle begins again. Okay, so up to now, you've been patient and gracious, even though I see some of you grimacing out there, to this sort of hypothetical, but not really, life story of 2 architects, and how the current academic and political and professional structures are less than supportive to their presence. I appreciate your patience. It hasn't necessarily been the most uplifting story or easily accessible. Many of you may have found the story affirming, others less than engaging, others still downright offensive, repetitive, or worse, unrealistic, or at the bottom, boring. For that, I apologize. However, I assure you that while the principal protagonists in this narrative were hypothetical, kind of, the story is not. It is a composite of actual lived experiences of people of color in this profession. I have lived it myself. Every obstacle encountered can be supported by material both quantitative and qualitative. Of course, there are exceptions, but that's not really the point. The point here is to highlight how this particular disciplinary system acts to limit the expectations, and thus exclude on every level. It limits exceptions. Thus, the remainder of my time, I will engage the primary point of the symposium, is how can we ensure more exceptions? How can we adjust a structure to accommodate them? So much so that they move from being exceptions to simply just being expected. And perhaps, as a way into this discussion, I want to close with a few points. 13. That's kind of a few, right? It's not 100. That just help prepare the way for easy exceptions into this expected status. They are not comprehensive by any means, any stretch of the imagination. They're simply offered as fodder for discussion either later on tonight, maybe over the next couple of days. It's fine. 6, address exclusion at the administrative level, and 7, sort of address the exclusion at the individual level. Okay, so as the Gandhi thing was already up there. I missed it. All right. First is student access. So I began the story at the high school level for a reason. It's one of the more critical areas for dismantling sort of the systemic exclusion, and it's a passive one. It's one that's easily addressed. Students simply don't know what's possible, or if they do, why it should be of interest to them. So a strategy in this area might include developing material, whether it's a brochure, website, social media attack, anything else, that specifically targets underrepresented students, both at providing both historical context and current information about the possibilities of this career. You send that material to overworked guidance counselors or teachers and the like, ask students, current students who are already in this field, to assist developing this material. They know, I won't say no. They have a sense of what these students would like about pursuing architecture. Make it a standing course or an activity, like developing a school journal. You have a department of recruitment. Or better yet, provide work study for those students. Make it a job. In addition, target existing students on campus as well. Lots of students don't know, even though they're on campus, they're just trying to figure out what they want to do. Ask them, get them involved. Why not introduce them to the field? And systematically track and evaluate this effort and adjust it every year, if not every semester. One size does not fit all, and diligence is required if you're trying to eliminate exclusion. Any effort in this area must begin with this point, and I have to be clear about this. It must be relevant to the lives of those you are recruiting. It has to be relevant. And if you can't figure out why architecture is relevant to people of color, then get out of the way. Because there are people who can. You have to empower them. Not to what you think is relevant, or what you think should be relevant. It's not about you. It's about those students. 2, curriculum access. Foundational courses that set the tone of what is worthy of note and admiration needs to take a long, hard look at what it teaches. Traditional reasoning, well, they're reliable material about people of color or other marginalized groups. It's not really available. That's crap. I found it. You find it. You have to want it. Educators must be encouraged to find this, to read it, and then teach it. Have to overcome the difficulty of ascribing validity to a knowledge base that's different than your own. In my field, it's particularly true in studios, where boundaries are set to reinforce cultural positions in which faculty feel comfortable. But that's to the exclusion of all else. One way to approach these difficulties is to examine why the boundaries have been placed where they are. Who gets to write that story? Ancillary access. Eliminating exclusion is hard work, but if it's a value, it simply must be done. There really is no other way. How can instructors properly educate students without being able to discuss with them or refer them to work that will make a cultural connection? If they come to the person who's supposed to know and they tell them they can't think of anybody, then they're going to believe they don't exist. That's what I would believe. Equally important, educators need to be able to tell majority students of these people as well. They just have to. There's no argument about this. None. Part-time access. If you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always gotten. Being serious about eliminating exclusionary outcomes requires work at both the student and faculty level. Be aggressively proactive, self-reflective, and critical about it. Don't wait until someone lands on your radar screen and you go, oh my gosh, we have to hire that person. Go looking for them. Find them. Better yet, build them. Develop them. Support them. And make it an ongoing project. The time to consider the pool is not when the position is announced, it's before. Make a list. Invite them to critiques. Invite them to come talk to a class. Start the connection. Full-time access. Now, there are two basic factors in folks getting hired in departments, and I really don't want to go into this too much because I know I'm getting close to when I'm supposed to stop. But there are two factors here. One is potential, and one is production. Now, you can choose whichever one you want, but you have to stick to it. Because they are not the same. You talk about potential, you are speculating. You're speculating on the ability of a particular person. If you're talking about performance or production, you're looking at their performance. One is a future hypothesis. The other is proven material. You cannot hire someone on speculation and then say, well, I didn't hire the other one because of performance. Speculate on them too. One or the other. You cannot have them both in a hiring process. That is a simple conflict of interest. And a way to hide behind the veil of, well, it was a fair process. We just can't find it. No. You set the criteria wrong. Support access. Once hired and admitted, expectations must become reasonable. They can't be the magic Indian. That's a slang word, I'm sorry. They can't solve all your problems, can't be representative on all committees. They can't have all the answers. And if they fail, try again. You do it with everybody else. Why is this a one-shot deal? It's unfair. It's unfair. And finally, if their research agenda is about dismantling this system, it's still tenure-worthy. Okay, to the excludees, or the excluded. First, be seen. Make your field, and consequently yourself, visible and available to those who just might choose it over being a policeman or a fireman or whatever. See it as an opportunity to educate. See it as an opportunity to educate. Whether it's architecture or whatever. See it as an opportunity to be your own Johnny Appleseed. Next, speak. Find opportunities to speak in public about what you know, because you know stuff. You know stuff they don't. Propose a topic, a panel discussion, exhibits, libraries, civic organizations, community centers. Stand on the street corner. It's an opportunity for institutions to present something different. It's part of their mission. Take advantage of what their mission is. Create. Help construct a pipeline for the future. Start or assist in a high school program. This is a program that I started back in 2006 and ran for 8 years. Had over 150 students come in. It was only 2 days a week. And we have had numerous people who have come to this program who graduated from Michigan and other schools around the United States. This is because Detroit only had one architecture program. We had no problem filling this program. None whatsoever. So much so, it was so successful that the school developed a year-long program for students. Half a day. They go to school half a day, they come to the architecture program for half a day. For a year. They got college and high school credits for this. It's free, totally free. Totally free. Now those are institutional. This is a hip-hop architecture camp and has been created by private firms. Make it relevant. This is relevant. It may not be relevant to you, it's relevant to them. And, as I was mentioning before, the dismal numbers of African Americans and as registered architects, there are a little over 400 registered architecture women, people of color, African American women in the United States. 400. That's mind blowing. Most of them know each other. They have a Rolodex. They know each other. How can you imagine knowing all the architects ever? That's amazing. So this young lady was number 400, so this was her. That's why it's called 404. Okay, so this is a great way to sort of begin that pipeline, building this pipeline. Critique. Make a list of your specialties for universities. Go to their lecture series. Get on their menu. If they only hire who they know, let them know you. All right. Sponsor. Private firms every year. Oh, that's great. For every year, we have we take students to Chicago. Most of them have never been on a train before. They're in Chicago for a weekend. It's funded by architectural firms and individual donors and foundations. People buy subscriptions for magazines, send them to the schools, to the art department, or whatever schools, or the technical, and they come and talk about it. Introduce people to what you do. Record. You have a story to tell. You've been in this for a while. Right? If no one asks you about what you do or where you are, go record it yourself. Right? Start a podcast. Go to YouTube. Do something. And finally, publish. Write. And write for different audiences. Don't just write for your professional friends. Write for everybody. Write. Whether it's journals, newspapers, blogs, books. Write and write and write. Look, I don't want to, I'm about to close. So I don't want you to think that I'm being naive. It's far from it. I know firsthand this is no easy task I'm setting out for administrators, for faculty, or for individuals. It's not. In fact, it's a Herculean task. I've been involved with some of this work, sometimes voluntary, sometimes not, for my entire academic and professional career. So I know it's not easy. And it's not possible for any one person to engage all 13 points simultaneously, or even over a course of a career. It's just not. It's simply too much to ask. But no one person should have to. However, at least one of these areas I've outlined above, and many, many more that I have not discussed, can be engaged right now. Your being here is proof of that. In fact, it's exactly the proper place to encourage, strategize, coordinate, learn, expand, and quite frankly, attack. Look, I said before this was semi-autobiographical. It's kind of close to not two people. But I was that kid. I was told by my guidance counselor I wasn't going to graduate. I was told by a school that I applied to, I don't care what you do, you're not getting in. Transferred twice. And, you know, so I know. Now, for somebody who was told that they're not good enough, you're not going to get in the program, being forced out the program, because I knew better, I ultimately stayed around till this happened. So everything I've written, everything I've told you, everything I've talked to you about today, just in May, was recognized by no less an institution like the Smithsonian of having value, of being an important conversation to have, despite how many times I was told to shut up in all different kinds of ways. So, in closing, I just want to say I'm happy and honored to be with you and such forward-thinking and, in all honesty, incredibly brave individuals. This can cost you, but what you're doing is dangerous. And I look forward to learning from you, working with you to achieve much more accessible and supportive communities in our respective fields. Thank you. Yeah, sure, I can stay. No, I can stay right here.
Thank you.
I get to do my Janet Jackson.
Yeah. Yeah, this is where you come into the music thing, yeah?
Right.
We might do that a little bit later in the bar. Okay, right. We were going to have a kind of response, but we're running out of time. So I'm sorry, I tried to get
No,
you did. It's fantastic. And I did think about, like, you know,
Give me the 5 minutes.
It was so extraordinarily important, particularly in terms of kicking off our discussions over the next 2 days. I mean, you kind of nailed it, basically. I mean, the 13 points. I don't want to say we could go home now because you've nailed it, because we've got work to do. But you've laid out a work plan for us, which I think is incredibly important and useful over the next few days. So let's keep those in mind and return to them. Maybe we should get them up on the website, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure, no problem.
Right. So we've got time maybe for 3 quick questions. If I've got something has anybody straight away got one while you're brewing?
Nobody wants to know how long my hair has been growing. No one is in it.
No, yeah? How long has your hair been growing?
No. I'm just trying to get a question.
No, okay.
You go, yes, ma'am.
Have you got a question, or did you want to know how long his hair's been growing?
Oh, 21 years. Okay, that was very facetious. I was just trying to get a question.
Okay, well, there you go.
There you go.
It's like warm up, you know. But okay, so while you're thinking, I was very struck by many of the things you said, but one thing in particular was about the institutionalization of knowledge, and you talked about it at many different points, but specifically around the temporality of the office, the longevity of the office, the fact that, you know, so many offices fail. I mean, so many, particularly in the financial climate at the moment,
Sure.
fail after one generation.
Yeah.
And for me, it's very interesting because there's another really important kind of revolutionary moment in your talk where you assert the importance of the institutionalization of knowledge. Whereas in the bourgeois, white, modernist art enclave that most of us exist within, we spend our time talking about the de-institutionalization of knowledge. So I was really struck by, and we talk about that for very good reasons. We want to destroy canons, we want to open up spaces, we want to proliferate, we want to create polyphonies, we want to have paratactical maneuvers. We do this, that we have good political, philosophical reasons for that. But you place this bomb in the centre of that argument by saying, actually, in this context, and of course, you're talking about architectural offices, but we might be talking about art institutions. We might also be talking about teacher training colleges. I mean, there might be all sorts of places in which, perhaps not quite as extraordinarily elitistly as within architecture, but nevertheless we have a common problem here. The bomb you place is about the institutionalization of knowledge. And I wondered, when you talk about that, what kind of response, retort do you get from the architectural profession?
Well, you have there are two things here. Architecture is a funny thing, because architecture is a profession, which is, tied to capital and, rising and falling economies and, efficiencies of production, all that stuff, right? So when you talk about institutions of knowledge within that realm, they're all for it, right? Because then I don't have to teach the student over and over and over again. Now they're much more efficient when they just fall into the system. They're just another cog in the wheel. So I don't have to spend time getting them up to speed, right? Everyone in the office knows what needs to be done. So we can, what does it take a village to raise a child? You have a whole village, you have an office. You raise that child. It's not one person's responsibility, right? So professional offices find it, they say, yes, absolutely, we need to do that. It's of saying that this is problematic. It's problematic to you in your research agenda or your project, but it's not problematic to other folks. So let's talk about what it is about, first of all, what knowledge are we talking about, right? Secondly, who's doing the institutionalization? Like, are you hoarding it so that other people can't get to it? Or are you sort of, this is sort of a bad term, but are you sort of protecting it and developing it and sharing it within that particular realm? So it's a different, like I said, architecture is a funny thing. If I'm talking about it from a professional standpoint, they absorb it. From the disciplinary standpoint, they find it problematic, but then they still do it. I mean, you're still going to history courses, you're still going to intro courses, you're still going to design studios, where there's this unwritten code of behavior. There's this unwritten hierarchy of aesthetics. And yet you're telling me that you don't want to institutionalize knowledge. That's not true.
Yeah.
That's not true. You just don't want to put my knowledge in there and have it institutionalized. That's what you don't want.
It's what Stuart Hall used to call it, the privilege of deconstruction.
Right. Here's the thing. I used to say this, and it used to make people mad. It still does. I used to say,
Let's see.
I want the right to be mediocre. Why do I have to be the super Negro all the time? I don't see any super non-Negroes. They're horrible. But they fail up. I want that. Not that I'm going to be mediocre, but I want the right to be mediocre.
Okay, we have a question from, we have two questions. One from Ella.
Yes. Who's that?
Now, hold on. Have we got a roving microphone? No, you just shout.
Yeah, okay. I just...
Oh, hang on.
Your microphone is going to be
I'm the roving microphone. With a
You know, here, you can use it, because I can talk loud. No, I can talk very loud. Oh, okay.
Thank you, it's really interesting. I was thinking about when you then enter the schools, do you work with a program on what are their idols? Because you had a list of musicians there, and how can, if all these white architectures are the thing you're learning, what references, how can we create references? Do you refer to architecture all over the place, or African continent, or from, can you say more about
all this stuff here is coming from that perspective that I'm talking about, right? So this is what I'm saying, you need to write for all audiences. This talk would be different in an architectural school, it's different here, it would be different at a community school, it would be different when I'm writing a newspaper, it's different when I'm writing a book, it's different when I'm writing a journal, but the story is the same. I'm writing for an audience. I'm trying to explain these issues to an audience, right? But the issues don't change. It's just the language changes. Like if you go to the library here, don't buy it because it's more expensive than you need to. But you go pick up my book, Aesthetics of Equity. It's 2 books within 1 book. The first part of the book is all what you would expect from an academic, right? All nicely cited and notated in the whole 9 yards. And the second half of the book is completely street. But it tells exactly the same story. Because I'm writing for 2 audiences. I'm writing for the academics, and if I only wrote for the academics, the students would never pick up that book. Never. But if I only wrote for the students, the academics would pick it up. So I wrote for both, put it in the same book. So now they both have the language to understand each other. But specifically, when we talk about history, there you go, right there. Go get it. You can't tell me that you can't teach it in your class because you can't find it. I'll send you one. It's right there.
Hey, thanks. That was really interesting talk. Just to follow up on this writing as outreach.
You can speak into the microphone.
Sure, can you hear me? Sorry. I'm curious about writing as influencing your studio practice, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about or give examples about how that there might be cross-pollination between these 2 creative fields that you're involved in.
Well, it's interesting, and it's one thing that I didn't talk about here, but it's actually one of the things that I've been most recently been asked to talk about at other institutions, is that about 20 years ago I wrote this article speculating on what a hip-hop architecture might be, right? And since then, to this point now, there have been sort of other people who have picked up on this thread. There are some architects who are working in various media, trying to sort of get to this. And I just got an email this morning from one of the sort of 5 or 6 cohorts that are really sort of working on this. That next year we have an exhibit in New York that's all about hip hop architecture, right? So. Sort of one of those moments where you have to, now the rubber meets the road kind of thing. All right, there's no more speculating, no more theory, you got to produce something. But the point is, so I wrote this thing, and various people have used it as sort of the foundation for studio. Just recently, Washington, D.C. hired a faculty member and his studio from Syracuse to look at I don't want to say reimagining, because it's not true. It's more about looking at 4 neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. that they're looking to sort of create a larger community plan for through the lens of hip-hop. And they got paid to do that. So, no, I'm serious, they did. I know. And nobody called me, I'm angry. But anyway, but that is, I hope I get Flannery a comment. I know you guys know who she is. I hope I get her quote right. Is that I don't know what I think until I read what I say. So I have to write it. And then I have to do it. So it's always this sort of back and forth between the sort of those two realms, for lack of a better term. Theory without practice means nothing.
On that note, and on the promise that you'll bust some moves in the bar.
Wow.
We're gonna have to stop you talking,
Okay.
despite the fact it breaks my heart.
Okay.
But anyway, you've got to be around.
Yes.
So you don't mind people collaring you, do you?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
No.
Okay, great. So let's have before I make the boring housekeeping announcements, let's have a final round of applause for Craig Wilkins.